Why have agents struggled to realize the potential? While we're seeing improvements in single player mode, what you really want is a multiplayer mode with state and memory across time. What we saw was that there was a common thread to the answer. And that common thread is the context graph. The most successful AI startups will be those that are able to build a moat by building a unique context graph.
That's a very powerful statement. So enterprises are now aware of context graph. Where do they start?
Well,
Hi, this is Siddharth Alwalia, your host at Neon Show and managing partner at Neon Fund. Today, I'm glad to host Ashu Garg, general partner at Foundation Capital, third time on Neon Show. Ashu, so glad to have you back again.
thank you for having me again. This has definitely become a habit.
You and Jaya, the article that you wrote on context graph has, cornered, I think, all the VC deal flow in the last one quarter. And it's just keeping on compounding, right? So today what we want to discuss is about the three things. What everyone agrees on, what questions are still unanswered, and what comes next, right? Just to start with, so to our audience who don't know or who haven't read the article, can you explain context graphs in layman?
Absolutely. Think of a context graph as the institutional memory for an organization. At its simplest level, it is an aggregation of the knowledge of why decisions were made, how they were made, who made them. And the why often has to be inferred from the how and the who. And so with that institutional memory of all that information that exists within an organization, which is partly in human beings' heads and is partly in a variety of digital traces, is the context graph in layman terms. And I can give you a little bit more of a technical definition in a minute if you'd like.
Sure, would love to learn that.
So at the root of a context graph is this notion of a decision trace. So as humans and agents collaborate to execute business processes, as you go through the 10 or 15 steps, often across multiple systems of record, across multiple communication systems. If you're making a decision, you might have a Zoom call, you might have an email trail, you might have a Slack message, you may have a phone call, and you might make a bunch of system calls to a bunch of systems of record. When you stitch all of that together with a time and state component, you get a decision trace. And historically, organizations do not have these decision traces in a form that can be processed. They have the outcomes. So systems of record capture the output of these decision traces. So what happened at the end? If you signed a deal with XYZ company at ABC price and gave so-and-so discount, that information is captured, but that's the outcome of a set of decisions that you made, and that set of decisions you made is a decision trace. When you aggregate decision traces together for an organization, in the context of a specific business process or sphere, depending on the abstraction, that becomes a context graph.
And when you wrote this article, why did it hit such a nerve? Why did it go viral?
So Jaya and I, and Jaya has been my sort of co-conspirator on this for the last year. For the last year, we've really been asking ourselves this question of why have agents struggled to realize the potential? The promise of agents, which we were all making 12, 18 months ago, has struggled. And while we're seeing improvements in single player mode, we're seeing improvements in single chat mode. What you really want is a multiplayer mode with state and memory across time and more automation. We have seen our portfolio companies work through these issues. And as Jay and I worked through this with companies like Maximor in finance automation, Player Zero in production engineering automation, and many others, what we saw was that there was a common thread to the answer. And that common thread is the context graph. And so our belief is that the most successful AI startups of the future will be those that are able to build a moat by building a unique context graph.
And today, is there a technology that can build this context graph?
Absolutely. The technology is not the barrier here. There are many companies. I talked about Maximor, I talked about Player Zero. There is Tessera, who's doing it for ERP migrations and automations. There is Olive that is doing that for sales, and Reggie for demand generation. So we have many examples of this in our portfolio. And there are many examples outside our portfolio, to be fair. I think it is very hard technically. I don't want to minimize the technical challenge. It requires a combination of building an organizational ontology So, the good old world of knowledge management and knowledge graphs, it requires very often the use of some sort of graph-based approach, hence the context graph. Now, you could have a graph in the form of a graph database. You could have a relational database with a graph layer. There are many implementation approaches, and it requires actually capturing state. So I have a portfolio company, Conviva, that is really working on data infrastructure where state becomes a first-class citizen. Because the sequence of events matters, and the time stamp of those events matters. And historically, that's not been true. Most databases have not really factored that. So event streams matter. So all of this is hard, but the best-in-class companies today have built context graphs, and they will be the winners of the future.
So what delta value are these kind of companies and the context graph is adding? Because what you are talking about is institutional memory that gets passed on or across the institution, like Amazon for leaders, right? For example, in Amazon, the context is you should follow the leadership principles, right? And if you are deviating from it, you get chided by the leaders on coming back.
So, for human beings, you can articulate principles at the level of decision, Amazon's leadership principles. It's a great example. And then human beings are expected to interpret the 8 or 10 Amazon leadership principles in a variety of situations.
Yeah.
How they interpret them, what decisions they make in real world situations, that's a decision trace.
Yeah.
Agents need that context. That's the context graph. The sum total of decisions that human beings made in real world situations, in interpreting those decision principles, that's a set of decision traces and therefore a context graph. The reason this matters is that in the absence of a context graph, we are struggling to get into a virtuous cycle of automation. You can do zero-shot question and answers with ChatGPT and Gemini. That's the model. And the models have gotten 100x better.
Yeah.
As the models are getting better, the quality of those responses is getting better. But human beings are not, don't function that way. If you're going through the process of selling, let's say you're selling some product to Disney.
Yeah.
You're trying to sell Disney. Let's say you're trying to sell your podcast rights to Disney. Think about the steps in the process. You are going to be talking to dozens of different people at Disney. That process takes 12, 18 months very often. You might eventually decide you wanted to get a 40% revenue cut. They were pushing for 20. Think of the back and forth that happens and all the different situations in which those interactions happen. If you now want an agent to automate that decision making. So on your side, you're like, oh, I'm only going to deal with Disney once. Why the hell would I want to automate it? But think about it from Disney's perspective. They're talking to podcast owners like yourself, very successful podcast owners, but they're talking to thousands of them.
Yeah.
So they're looking for an agent that's going to automate a series of those decisions. That automation requires some memory of what other human beings did. And it's a staircase approach. Today, the interface might be human being asks the agent, okay, tell me what was done in the past.
Yeah.
And human beings make all the actions. Step 2 might be the agent starts to make recommendations. So you're not providing data. The human, the agent is the manager, and the human being is the employee conceptually. Yeah. We can imagine a world where the dynamics are changing, but the conversation is human because you don't want to talk to an agent, you want to talk to a human, but the decision is being made by an agent. The agent is the manager. So that's the continuum. We could also imagine a world where there's no human being involved. The Disney agent talks to your agent and they strike a deal. To get to that, and that might not make sense for everything, but there are many situations where that makes sense. To get to that nirvana, we need context graphs.
And how would these agents store the context graph? Because let's say, if like I'm talking to Ashu right now, right? So my agent is only talking over my either WhatsApp, email, or Slack with your agent, right? But the context that we have right now, or the relationship we have without an agent, right? The agent is not able to capture.
So that's what makes this hard. And the question is, at what abstraction do you store this information? We believe that the companies that win in the era of context graphs will find a way to deliver enough value that they earn the right to build the context graph. If Maximo were to go to a finance team and say, I'm going to sell you a context graph. Why? Like, why don't I?
Yeah.
I didn't wake up today by looking to buy a context graph. Yeah. No customer is, I love my idea, but that's not what customers want to buy. Yeah. So Maximo has to go to finance teams and convince them that I will help you solve the business problems you care about. That could be cash reconciliation. It could be, I want to have audit-ready automation. I want to have a certain level of verifiability. So the business value proposition doesn't change. As a founder, you have to identify that. By delivering a certain level of automation, you might say, look, I'm not going to close the books for you. I'm going to identify Maybe just even something as simple as analytics. I'm going to help you automate the analytics of closing the books. And if that value proposition is sufficient for a customer, they will give you access to the data. You then, as the provider, Maximote in this example, has to stitch that data together. Now, it's entirely possible that I've been given access to email trails, I've been given access to the ERP system, NetSuite most likely, I've been given access to the billing system, Stripe, I've been given access to Zora because that's where I'm doing my subscription billing, and so on. I may not have access to your WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So I'll have incomplete decision traces. But if I do a certain level of automation, the next step will be for you to say, okay, you know what, I'm getting value out of this. Let me integrate my WhatsApp into this as well. So that's the ladder. And there's a virtuous cycle of, as agents deliver more value, organizations and human beings will be more comfortable sharing more data.
So let's take example of Maximo, since you mentioned them a couple of times. What delta they are able to deliver to their customers in reconciliation as compared to any XYZ tool, because they're using context graph?
So look, obviously this varies from customer to customer, but the common pattern we're seeing is we're seeing a 30 to 80% reductions in exceptions. So you see pretty dramatic, because eventually finance reconciliation is all a function of handling exceptions.
Yeah.
The book should close automatically. This invoice should tie to this purchase order, should tie to this payment. And whenever it doesn't, that's an exception.
Yeah.
Nirvana would be 0 exceptions. It's all automated away. We're not there yet, and there will be a time, but we are seeing dramatic changes. But I'll give you another example of a context graph in this ladder. I have a company called Vivin, started by another Ashu Garg and Varun Kacholia. So Varun and Ashu, who are also the founders of Eightfold, had this idea that we need to capture the institutional memory of a human as a digital twin. So, same thing, human beings have state. Let's imagine there was a digital twin of you and a digital twin of your wife. And so when you're sitting here in the US, your wife can query your digital twin to say, hey, have we paid this bill? Have we done this? Have we done that? Or I need to do X, Y, Z. So a digital twin of human in a business context, I could take a personal example there. That's what Vivin is building. And so where is the context graph coming from? Well, it starts off by you give it access to certain data sets. You might say, most people give it access to email. They give it access to their Google Docs or SharePoint or Dropbox folders. Most people don't want to start off by giving access to all Zoom calls or phones. But with the set of data it has, it starts to build, a context graph of you. And so when you ask the model questions about yourself, hey, did I pay the bill? Or I talked to Ashu 2 years ago. Can you remind me what I talked to him about? It starts to deliver value to you. If employees in your organization, let's say you had a Vivin twin for every single employee. You have a CFO, you're sitting here in the US, at the middle of the night in India, you're trying to figure out, well, we were trying to close this term sheet. What happened? I mean, it's sitting in someone's email, it's sitting in some, the term sheet is sitting in some SharePoint or the Google Docs. If it's signed, the signed version is sitting. Well, the digital twin can answer that question. So depending on the role, depending on the person, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 80%. But somewhere between 20 and 80% of the questions you have are answerable by a digital twin in that case. Because that twin has built an institutional memory of you, the individual, your role, your organization, and that's the context graph effectively. Now, over time, you could imagine that twin is willing to do more than just answer questions. Because this is such a broad up product, like a digital twin has such broad ramifications. The current approach is not to automate decisioning, is to make information available. But as I said, that's a staircase. Tomorrow you can imagine that the CFO starts to say, hey, it's configured that if you were to ask for something, instead of giving you a response, it can actually make a decision on the CFO's behalf. Let's say an employee would ask for approval for an expense. The system could approve that expense because it has the decision traces of what would the CFO have done in the past. And if it's within those parameters, it will approve it.
So in many cases, this context is a moat of an organization, right? So why would an organization, typically try to share it with a startup that they are working on? Because then, the moat is out there.
Look, the most valuable asset of a company is its context graph. Yeah. And the reason context graphs have not been stolen was it's very hard to build, as you said, and organizations are rightly nervous about, hey, if I let everyone build a context graph of me as a customer, what is my organizational value? So first and foremost, context evolves, context graphs will evolve. And so my first response to that is relax. Human beings are not that easily replaceable. That said, on a more serious note, I do think data security, data governance, access controls, which agents can access what parts of a graph, See, the downside of stitching everything together is now it's all available in one place. And so, I mean, just take, the interaction we talked about in the case of Vivint. Vivint spends a lot of time thinking about this issue because as they stitch together your emails and all of your data into a digital twin of you and a digital twin of your CFO, and you can query your CFO when he or she is asleep. Well, the CFO's email has, and data might have all of their professional information, but it may also have their personal social security number. It may have their credit card number. They had a fight with their spouse. It may have all of that, in the same email, because the lines between our personal and professional lives are blurred. And so a large part of the access control technology for Vivint is stripping that out. And many startups like Vivint will build that within their infrastructure, and it's a core part of their own IP. But for most companies, you will want to buy a third-party stack. And I have a company called Skyflow. And Skyflow, and definitely someone you should talk to in your podcast. Skyflow is one of those data security technologies, which, while it has existed prior to the context of context graphs, is purpose-built. So Skyflow is purpose-built for securing context graphs. It will allow you to sort of control the data that goes in. So as emails, for example, are flowing into the context graph, in real time, in line, it can strip out PII, personally identifiable information. So you don't want people's social security number in a context graph, perhaps, and perhaps you do. Perhaps you want the last 4 digits. So it can strip out in a way that makes sense. And by the way, it can mask and anonymize the data. So it may strip it out, put something else. It's a key value pair that you have sort of, you can go back to it in a more secure vault. Second, you actually have to have identity controls. Your agent is allowed to act. You may have a shared context graph between you and your CFO. When your CFO wants to access the context graph, it's okay for her agent or his agent to access personal information. When you're accessing that context graph, it's not okay for you to access personal information. What you can access versus an employee in the organization can access. Because context is a function of pairwise relationships. When I ask you a question how things are going, your wife asks you the question how things are going, and your CFO asks you the question how things are going, you have very different answers to the same question. That's context. There's pairwise context there. And that has to be captured in a context graph. But then when the agent is answering on your behalf, access controls become really important.
So have you created a new market on context graphs through the work that you and Jaya have done?
We believe context graphs will be the basis for the next $1 trillion AI opportunity. Like all markets, it's a combination of things old and new. In the last 6 weeks since we talked about context graphs, SaaS stocks have collapsed 30 to 40%. I don't think I want to take any credit for that. I've definitely lost some money, a lot of money actually. But I think it's a sign of that the era of systems of record is coming to an end.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean they'll go away. Databases still exist. Databases will exist forever. New types of databases will create. I think systems of record will exist. But the value they capture relative to the total pie will decline. So in absolute terms, they might still do well. And so the correction might be an overreaction, but their relative value is clearly the market is signaling, and we agree that existing systems of record are not the natural owners of the context graph. And so they will capture a declining share of the value that's created by technology. And I think entirely new categories will get created. I have a portfolio company, Tessera. They're automating ERP maintenance and migration. They won a very large contract. Tessera won a $25 million contract from a Fortune 50 corporation, and they went from $0 to $25 million in bookings.
Yeah.
When does that happen for a startup? But the more interesting question is why? And I wish I was sitting in the boardrooms in that Fortune 50 company when this decision was being made. That decision trace would have been fun. But my understanding of it is that they were willing to give Tessera 25 because they cut $75 million out of their SI bill. Not an Indian SI in this case, but an SI. Yeah. So that $75 million that was going to think at Deloitte and EY and Accenture or one of these players, instead was shared as $50 million of saving by the Fortune 50 company and $25 million by Tessera. Is that a new market? Not really in this case. It's a cannibalization of an existing market. The other thing that will happen is that, in the case of a Maximore, you might actually choose to, instead of scaling your finance team from 5 people to 8 people, you may do the same work with 5 or more work with 5. Yeah. You're capturing a larger share of the OpEx of a company. That's a completely new market. If a Vivint allows people to be twice as productive, maybe they will spend half as much time at work, or maybe they'll spend 80% as much time at work, a little more leisure, and companies will do much more. Yeah. So I think of this as really, it is expanding the pie for everyone. I think first and foremost, I'm excited about the fact that it will allow us to automate the mundane in our lives. And it will both enable and force. So there are two sides of the coin, human beings to step up our game. And as long as human beings step up our game, we will become managers of agents. So I think humans have a choice. We can be managed by agents or we can be managers of agents. And my hope is that we will all become managers of agents.
I'll give another example from our portfolio. You know Samir Kohli from Buddy.
Yes, great guy.
Yeah. So in Buddy, they have created AI teammates for senior care living homes. So these AI teammates are not EAs. So they tell tasks, they create tasks for the sales team that, hey, you didn't talk to this senior for this amount of time, or this is the right time to talk, or this is the time to give them a wine, this is the time to visit their house, right? So the AI teammate, it doesn't have a UI, first of all, and it creates tasks for the entire sales team.
That's what managing. Those salespeople are being managed by agents.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, that's the future. Managed by agents, manager of agents. We all get to pick.
Yes. But, have you thought about enough? What is the complete infra required? Would these context graph reside on Databricks, Snowflake, or the complete new infra required? One is to store them, other is to access them. And what are the opportunities these are creating, right, in terms for new companies?
Look, both Databricks and Snowflake are remarkable companies, and I was very lucky to be a seed investor in Databricks specifically. And both companies have leaned in to the infrastructure opportunity for systems of agents and therefore for context graphs. Databricks has agent bricks, and Databricks is agent infrastructure, including all the backend data processing and data. They acquired Neon, the database company, and so on. So you can build context graphs on Databricks, and they can be the enabling infrastructure. You can also use, other databases. There are people using Neo4j. I spoke to the CEO of Neo4j a few days ago, and they have customers building context graphs on top of them. In the case of Vivint, they're building on top of good old-fashioned Postgres, with a lot of sophisticated, code and programming there. In the case of Olive, they have built 80 plus SLMs, small language models, because the way they capture the context is by fine-tuning SLMs on particular parameters in that business process. So I think the implementations are manifold. The common theme is that this is hard today. And our focus is on finding exceptionally strong technical founders who deeply understand the enabling infrastructure required to build a context graph, deeply understand the middleware and application layer infrastructure to build agents on top of existing models. In many cases, not all cases, deeply understand model training and model fine-tuning because they are doing fine-tuning and training of their own models on top of the foundation models. Those three things we think are the bare minimum from a technology standpoint. And then on top of that, you have to understand the business problem because ultimately you have to solve a business problem versus a technical problem if you're building an application.
So we talked about some of the vertical, like Maxima in finance, right? So do you think the first large application would be vertical or horizontal, and which would eventually win?
Ultimately, I think it's not an either or. So I think there will be the $1 trillion plus opportunity will get captured by 100 plus winners in context graphs. So I think there are many, many ways to win. And some of those paths to success will be horizontal and some will be vertical. And we're investing in both. For example, my partner Joanne has a very successful context graph company in Tenor, which is going after healthcare.
Yeah. So what I'm learning from you is you were already working on it, but it's just that nobody named the nomenclature in the last year.
I think, look, new technology, it is not a new technology. It's not like Spark, which at its core was, it didn't exist and then one day it existed.
Yeah.
So, and the basis of Databricks was Spark. But today when you think Databricks, most people don't even know about Spark.
Yeah.
So very often ideas start with a single technical breakthrough and compound from there. In the case of context graph, that's not it. It is an approach that has been emerging, I would say, for the last couple of years. Because, if you go back in time, it was only 2 years ago that people started talking about agents. And we had coined the term systems of agents. And, there was conversations around agent harnesses and this and that, all of which were an attempt to figure out how do we have large agent swarms? So that human beings can be managed by agents and become managers of agents.
Yeah.
As we have all done that, I think we started to realize that there was a gap. And that gap, and the solution to that problem, that there was a problem, the solution to that problem is context graphs. And so it's emerged over time. For Jaya, Joanne, and I, who've really been in the trenches at Foundation working on this, it has come from the interaction with our portfolio companies, first and foremost. They have tried to articulate what are they doing, what is their source of defensibility, how are they driving increasing automation of tasks, how are they capturing institutional memory, and we've had a dozen conversations with a dozen different companies. I've only given you 3 or 4 examples.
Yeah.
And then somehow at some point it clicked that there's a common pattern. They're all building a context graph. And many more are outside our portfolio.
No, I would definitely like to have a digital twin of Ashu where rather than forwarding you an email, would this company be interesting? I'll just forward it to the digital twin and no.
I have one. It's still in beta testing.
Okay.
But Vivian has helped me build a digital twin of Ashu.
Okay.
And I can query it, my assistant can query it, and my assistant's happy because, I'm sometimes hard to find.
Because sometimes when email are not answered, I think that, is Ashu busy or is the company not interesting enough?
I apologize for that, but the twin will solve that.
Yeah.
So, we have to ask the other Ashu Garg, who's the CEO of Vivian.
Yeah, but would love to see it in production.
Absolutely.
You mentioned about a system of this agents, right, to solve these problems. Can you dive deeper into this?
So, I think what we're all realizing is that the future is agent swaps.
What does it mean?
So that you'll have multiple agents.
Yeah.
And the way a complex business process will get automated is agents will be task specific. And the task can be sliced and diced in a variety of ways. And so why do you need multiple agents and why do you want to have task specific agents? Because you need guardrails. You need to be able to bound. Agents do hallucinate because models hallucinate. Yeah. Now, human beings also make mistakes. We all forget, if we didn't forget, we would have no driving accidents. And we know that the agents driving the Waymos are actually much safer than human beings. So I think you can have superhuman performance for specific classes of tasks, but it requires us to break down the aggregate tasks into smaller tasks, have agents that do smaller tasks. And the systems that build agents, is what we call the systems of agents. And that's I think of this technology as I said, in 3 buckets. I think of it as the context graph, which is the enabling infrastructure. I think of it as the model layer, and I think of it as the agent harness. And when you put this together, you get a collection of agents, a system of agents, an agent swap, pick your favorite word.
So I assume each of the companies, the 11 companies that you have mentioned about, they have built system of agents.
Yes, we are either investing in 2 things. We're either investing in systems of agents, or we're investing in enabling infrastructure. The common theme across these is the context graph. And so companies like Skyflow that I mentioned, or Fortanix, are enabling technologies for context graphs, whereas companies like Maximo, Vivin, Tessera, Player Zero are actually, building those context graphs in the context, no pun intended, of a particular business process or a particular vertical or function.
I find one of your companies, Arise, very interesting because it sits in the infra layer for this context graph.
Absolutely, yes. So Arise is another great example where, for your audience, Arise is really the monitoring layer. If you have AI agents and you have models making decisions, you need some way to monitor what they're doing. They are the police force, and the CIA all put together for the agent work. They monitor, evaluate what's called evals. They see what the agents did. They see what prompts you provided as a human being, what was the response, and it's very meta. They use models to monitor models because the model output is so large. Human beings cannot monitor models. So it's a very technical team that is building one of the core components of the enabling infrastructure for context graphs.
In previous era or in the SaaS era, the teams were, now you have mentioned technical teams a few times, right? I'm going to harp on that. It required a very strong GTM CEO or a GTM co-founder. Has it changed in the recent agentic era where you're mentioning like very strong technical teams?
So what remains true is that technology always struggles to find product market fit. And ultimately, the companies that succeed find product market fit. I mean, Databricks started in 2013, but it took 3-4 years and a lot of going around in circles for them to get to the point where they had product market fit. So companies need to find product market fit. And ultimately, it is the job of the CEO to find product market fit. You can hire salespeople, you can hire marketing people, you can hire product people, but the difference between a great and an average CEO is their ability at the 0 to 1 to find product market fit. Now, the job of a CEO changes every year. So once you have product market fit, there are other challenges. But that's the first step. Sometimes deeply technical founders have a natural passion for product, have a natural passion for go-to-market, and have the learning ability to become go-to-market first founders. That's my favorite kind of founder. Like huge success for me when I look at the Ashutosh at Eightfold and Vivin, Kabir at Desera, and many other CEOs that I've worked with over the years. Mohit and at Cohesity, they are brilliant technologists. Like you do not want to go. Very few people can go toe to toe with Mohit at Cohesity and Nutanix and build a better storage layer. He's one of the top maybe 2 or 3 people in the world who can do that. And at the same time, when JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley calls and says, I want to talk to somebody, they want to talk to Mohit. So that's rare, but that's the founder we look for. A technical founder that has a passion and has acquired the skills in go-to-market.
So necessarily storytelling has taken a backseat then, because naturally the CEOs had the flair for.
Absolutely not. I disagree. I think storytelling is, at the heart of humanity is storytelling. Religion is a story.
Yeah.
Money is a story. Ultimately, the very human existence beyond the difference between humans and animals is stories. So at the very heart of humanity is storytelling. The question for us is, how do we find, as investors, we need to find founders who have enough technical depth. And really, we are pushing the limits of technology, and the limits are changing by the month, by the week. So if you were technical 5 years ago and are no longer technical, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
So how do you find the balance between deeply technical founders who are exceptional storytellers with investors, exceptional storytellers with their employees, and most importantly, with customers?
So enterprises are now aware of context graph. Where do they start?
Ultimately, the most successful enterprises of 2030. So let's zoom out.
Yeah.
We're early in this trend. I believe that 4 years from now, the winners and losers on the S&P or the Nifty in India, the winners and losers will be separated by their ability to embrace context graphs.
That's a very powerful statement.
I think that will be true because the companies that embrace these context graphs will be on a very different productivity curve. Context graphs will drive organizational productivity. And when you sum that up, it drives societal productivity. So where do you start? Well, that depends on the organization. If you are the CIO organization in a Fortune 100 company and you are thinking about an SAP or an Oracle migration, well, call 1-800-Tessera. Because if you are looking to drive a major, system of record migration without exploring what, the context graph first that companies have to offer, I think you're being remiss in your job. No, whether it's the right company for you, the right technology, like every company has to make its own decision. But I think every CIO has an obligation to their organization to explore that. If you're the CFO of an organization and you have 300, 400, 500 people, whether they're in India or in Philippines or in the US, doing accounts reconciliation, you have an obligation to explore context graph. You have to ask yourself, why do I have 500 people doing this? Can I have 100 people doing accounts reconciliation and 400 people adding some other value to the organization? If you are a VP of sales at a large company, you have to ask yourself, typically in a large organization, half the company is in go-to-market. I mean, even in the most sophisticated technology database, we have many thousands of people in go-to-market. I think we have to ask ourselves the question, that which of these individuals will be managed by agents and which of them will step up to manage agents? And both will happen. But if we don't have agents in the mix, we will be left behind in the productivity race. And I think that's the future.
So essentially, what you're saying is, and you can correct me, you are betting the firm on context graph.
We are betting foundation on 2 mega trends, AI and blockchain.
Okay.
We believe that AI is going to reinvent how humans live, work, and play. And we've talked a lot about that. Context graphs is an enabler of that. We also believe that blockchain is going to reinvent money as we know it. And the very nature of money is going to change because of blockchains. And we're betting the firm on those 2 things. And we've had tremendous success with blockchain. We were the first investors in Solana. We've been very successful in many other blockchain technologies. Blockchain is a more nascent, and therefore we are seeing more ups and downs in that technology. But it's just as powerful as AI as a technology. Within AI, there are many bets you can make, and it's not an either or. We believe that there will be, there is a post-LLM world. And in a post-LLM world, you will see new model architectures. So we're already betting on new model architectures. We believe that in a post-LLM world, we will see completely new approaches to agent harnesses and agent frameworks. And so we're looking long and hard. And at the same time, we believe that a critical piece of the AI stack is the context graph. And so we are making a very large investment in context graphs, whether it is in application companies, the systems of agents, or the enabling technologies like Skyflow and Fortanix, Arise, and many others.
What I am observing is the narrative in AI is shifting towards winner takes all. Is that true then?
I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that. I don't see the evidence. If anything, I think the evidence is the opposite. If we were having this conversation a year ago, people would have, and many people, including myself, in varying degrees, were saying, hey, we think OpenAI is going to win.
Yeah.
A year ago, many people were saying, hey, we see Llama really, Meta was back in the game.
Yeah.
And we were all counting out Gemini. And Anthropic was sort of a niche.
Yes.
Fast forward a year, Gemini is back in business, baby.
Yeah.
So they're starting around.
Yeah.
And so Gemini is a legitimate alternative to ChatGPT. The Gemini model stack is a legitimate alternative to the OpenAI stack. Anthropic has really, exploded in the enterprise and has carved out a very legitimate and defensible market segment for itself. And we don't talk much about Llama today. But I won't rule out Facebook. They're down the road. And I would not rule them out. I think a year from now, we could be having a very different conversation. So this is by no means, even the model layer is not a winner-takes-all market. In fact, the question we have to ask ourselves is, given how competitive intensity is increasing in the model layer, will the model providers be able to capture returns proportionate to the investments they're making? And I think the answer is unknown. It is unclear how much value the model providers will capture in the long term. Even OpenAI has shifted from purely releasing the best model to try to win at the application layer, which is ChatGPT. So I don't believe that's a winner-takes-all at all. I do think that enduring companies have to build moats. Like ultimately, if you get commoditized, you'll become one of 1,000 people in any one category. So the old adage that in any category, there are 3 winners and then a long tail of maybes or have-nots. And there's almost sort of a 60-30-10 split between 1, 2, and 3, I think continues to hold. And so our goal as investors is to find the 1, 2, or 3 in every category. I think context graphs will create 100 plus winners, and my goal is to be in as many of them as possible.
Yeah. Also, you're saying because you are telling this is a $1 trillion category of context graphs, so 100 plus winners are going to emerge.
$1 trillion in revenues, by the way. Hopefully many more trillions in market cap.
Wow. But coming back to the infra, like LLMs have short-term memory. Context graphs require long-term persistent memory. So do we need to solve memory first before we talk about context graphs?
Look, memory is inherent in context graphs, and memory is inherent in technology. So when you say, do we have to solve memory? I think we have solutions. A database is memory. You have relational databases which capture a point in time. You have event stream databases. There are databases which capture, the time dimension of memory. You have structured and unstructured databases. So I think many of the components exist. There is also a ton of innovation that is being done and has been done around model memory, around memory between, how do you have short-term state versus long-term state. And yes, there are many, many fundamental questions about memory that are unsolved. So what makes this opportunity exciting and challenging, both at the same time, is the context graph of today may not be the context graph of tomorrow because the stack is changing. And innovations in memory, whether it's model memory or agent memory or system memory, whether it's short-term or long-term memory, innovations in memory will change the nature of the context graph.
And have you thought about, as the technology emerges, what will context graph be replaced by?
It's 6 weeks old. Yeah. So hopefully context graphs is the idea of 2026, and we'll see what happens in 27.
And we discussed about, but just for our audience, I want to harp on again. For any organization, for Foundation Capital, for Neon or Disney, where will the context graph reside?
Where the context graph resides will depend on the business function and the organization. But let me step back. First and foremost, every organization will have multiple context graphs. There is no one world model or one world context graph in any organization. That's our bet. An organization like Disney may have 30, 40, 50, 100 context graphs. Just like there's no one data lake to rule them all in any organization. Now, you may choose to have one context graph for all your customer data. You may choose to have a context graph for all your legal data. And by the way, two context graphs, your customer context graph and your legal context graph, may have intersecting data, may query each other. And agents may query both context graphs to arrive at an answer. Some of these context graphs, many of these context graphs, I would say, will be embedded in startup companies, hopefully not startups at that point, public companies, but are today companies like Maximo and Tessera and Olive and Vivin that are, built by these companies, by technology providers, but are owned, the data rights to those graphs will be owned by their customers. So many of those context graphs will be built that way. And every Global 2000 company will build many context graphs in-house. And when they build it in-house, that's when they need the data control layer or the data security layer from a Skyflow. That's when they need the, decision trace evals layer from Arise and so on and so forth. And many of those companies will build it on top of Databricks or Snowflake. So both will be true.
So clearly, what you believe in and the world that we are going towards is startups have an advantage over incumbents because context graph doesn't come natural to incumbents. Like for example, for Salesforce, they have to rewrite themselves. For ServiceNow, they would have to rewrite themselves. Right. So over a long period of time, then 10 years, this system of record should be replaced, the current system of record.
Systems of record companies have a choice. They will either choose to embrace context graphs, or many of them will, sort of bury their head in the sand the way an ostrich does, and the rest will be history for them. For the companies that choose to embrace context graphs, and I think, whether it's ServiceNow or Salesforce, at least those companies, I think, have been very, very proactive about embracing, to their credit. They still have a set of very hard decisions to make. They have build versus buy. How do I build or do I buy? To what extent do I want to be backward compatible with the existing Salesforce architecture, which is their strength, that is their moat, but that is also their constraint. To what extent do they want to be interoperable with other systems? Context graphs are not bound by system constraints. You're not going to build a context graph on top of your Salesforce data. You're going to build a context graph on top of your sales process. And every business process touches dozens of systems in a large company. And so incumbents will have to figure out, how do I become interoperable with other systems of record, other technology providers? And some will build and some will buy, and some will perish. And some will build and buy and then perish. So I think it's a huge opportunity for startups. But I also think that the incumbents, have strategic advantages. And so I am bullish that they will also capture some share of this value. And so I'm a buyer of Salesforce, and I'm a buyer of Salesforce stock, I'm a buyer of Snowflake stock, and I'm a buyer of ServiceNow stock.
So there is, debate on the biggest value capture in context graph. So human in the loop versus handoff execution. What are your views, how in the building of these context graph?
Look, ultimately, both will be true. Humans have to be in the loop. And so I think human in the loop is very important. And in some cases, humans will be in the loop to make the final call. In other cases, humans will be in the loop as an FYI. And in yet more cases, humans will, just have evals to evaluate the decision traces, because so many decisions are being by agents that even the FYI is an overload of information. So all things will be true. And, I think it's, I personally don't spend too much time thinking about the details of that mix 5 years from now. I think it's going to change. It's going to change. What it will look like in 2030 is different from what it will look like in 2026. There are only three things I know for sure. I know for sure that over the last 10, 20,000 years, human beings have continued to flourish human beings have continued to flourish and built upon technical innovation. And so that will be true over the coming decade. So I'm very bullish on the human race. Second, I believe it to be true that the rate of change of automation as a result of AI will continue to accelerate. And the winners and losers on the S&P and the Nifty will be decided by their willingness to embrace automation and their willingness to invest behind, I think, the third most important thing, context graphs. You build organizational context graphs, whether you build it in-house or you build in partnership with startups, whether you build some in-house and some in partnerships. But every organization needs to embrace context graphs. Every organization needs to embrace automation. And every organization, needs to have the confidence that, like every generation before it, we will benefit from this innovation and not cow or bow down to it.
So till now, has any enterprise called you that we are hiring a chief context graph officer?
I hope not. I hope not. I'm still gainfully employed at Foundation. Not looking for that job.
No, but are they creating such kind of roles?
Look, I think we're definitely seeing a lot of interest from chief data officers, a lot of companies have hired chief AI officers. And who knows, tomorrow, chief context graph officers.
And what time, like there have been various debates, like from Dharmesh, from Arvind, from Glean, that, people are believing it's just this thing that we are very far away, because till now, even semi-autonomous agents are not delivering.
Look, I think if you go back to the debate around context graphs, both Dharmesh and Arvind, I think, have been great collaborators on this discussion, as has Levie at Box, or Jamin from Altimeter, or Animesh from Player Zero, and many others. I think it's very consistent that the idea of a context graph is shared by most pioneers of application or AI technologies. It is also very clear that it is a word that means different things to different people. And it is also very clear that the very nature of context graphs will evolve. And so the timeline, is a little bit like a mirage. It's around the corner. Yeah. And so we can build context graphs today. And the companies that I have mentioned have built context graphs today. And I think we will look back in 3 years and say, oh my God, that stuff was so primitive. The context graphs of 3 years from now will be 10 to 100x better than today's context graphs, because the enabling technology will make them better. And the decision traces you capture will make them better. See, key to the context graph idea is the notion that decision traces, compound. As you capture decision traces, you earn the right to capture more decision traces. And that compounding of capturing decision traces is what makes for a richer context graph. And as the context graph gets richer, you need more enabling technology.
You also talk about the orchestration layer, right? Can you dive deep into it, like where startups would win an orchestration layer, right? And do you believe this is the right layer where, value will be captured?
So ultimately, as we talked about, if I go back to the beginning, a context graph is the aggregation of decision traces. Decision traces can only be captured if you're in the orchestration or you're in the flow of those decisions. If you ask a human being to sit down and write down a decision trace, you're going to get a bunch of swear words from it.
Yeah.
And even if they're willing to do it, they can't, because most human beings are not a template. When we make the same decision 20 times, 30 times, we make it slightly differently. We may end up with the same outcome, or we end up with different outcomes.
Yeah.
So capturing decision traces requires capturing the decisions as human beings interact with agents over time across hundreds of thousands of decisions. The only systems that can capture that are systems that are orchestrating those decisions. Whether that is a startup like Maximo or Tessera or Vivint, or it could be an incumbent that builds an application. But if you're not in the flow of the decision, if you're not orchestrating those decisions, you have no ability to capture them. A database vendor can't capture them because they're not in any one database. An analytics vendor cannot capture them because they capture the outcome, not the why and the how. And the only people who capture the how decisions are made are the orchestrators of those decisions. And you can infer the why from the how.
So one of our companies called PitCrew is by third-time founders, Rishi and Samir. They sold their first company to Freshworks, second to LegalZoom. The third company that they're building is the orchestration layer for wealth advisors in the US.
Look, you take wealth advisors, it's a highly automatable opportunity. Most wealth advisors have a lot of back office, compliance processes, a lot of processes to sort of automate the execution of what their high net worth clients ask them to do, whether it is money management or it is helping them buy their planes or helping them manage their real estate. So I think it's a big opportunity. So congratulations to them.
Thank you so much, Ashu. Love the discussion.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you for making context graphs the idea of 2026.
Yeah, thank you so much for building this idea.
Thank you for having me.